And make no mistake, justice will be done.
The U.S. president condemns the attack on the American consulate in Libya, which left the U.S. ambassador and 3 others dead. We examine the impact of the incident on U.S. foreign policy in the region and on the U.S. presidential campaigns. You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Ambassador Chris Stevens died during violent protests in Benghazi. Angry demonstrations in Libya and in Egypt were apparently sparked in response to a low-budget film depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad as a pedophile and womanizer. US President Barack Obama called the attacks, quote, outrageous and shocking.
We reject all efforts to denigrate the religious beliefs of others. But there is absolutely no justification to this type of senseless violence. None.
The president's response appears now to have become an election issue after his Republican opponent accused the president of sympathizing with those who carried out the attacks.
The administration was wrong to stand by a statement sympathizing with those who had breached our embassy in Egypt, instead of condemning their actions. It's never too early for the United States government to condemn attacks on Americans and to defend our values.
Romney was referring to a statement issued by the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, which was released ahead of the protests. That statement, which the White House was quick to point out was not approved by the administration, said, quote, the U.S. Embassy in Cairo condemns the continuing efforts by misguided individuals to hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, end quote. We spoke to Romney campaign surrogate and Republican strategist Joe Watkins. He told us Romney's criticism of Obama was simply a matter of political calculation.
I think Mitt Romney did what he had to do. He's locked in a very, very tight presidential campaign right now. All the polling data shows that President Obama got a 6-point bump coming out of the Democratic National Convention. And so Mitt Romney has to work very, very hard to regain some kind of opportunity and hopefully for him a lead. So he had to respond to what happened in Libya. He had no choice but to make a response and to respond quickly. And
that response was President Obama sympathizes with the people who killed 4 Americans.
Well, he had to say something that, on the one hand, criticized President Obama and his foreign policy stance, and at the same time showed his resolve as a candidate and as a possible future president, as somebody who would have resolve, who sympathizes with the families that have lost loved ones, that at the same time says the act itself was despicable, and to leave the door open for some kind of a response that's appropriate given what took place.
Who was he trying to appeal to? As you said, President Obama sympathized with possibly radical Islamists who killed 4 Americans.
Mitt Romney would be trying to appeal to all those people who haven't decided yet who they support, and also the Democrats who might be strong on national defense, who may feel that President Obama has not been as strong a commander-in-chief when it comes to foreign policy issues. And so Mitt Romney is trying to get their vote, and the way to do that is by making a strong statement, a statement that strongly criticizes President Obama and President Obama's stance on this particular issue as well as on other issues.
Beyond then what you're presenting is a pretty nakedly political calculation on the part of the Romney campaign, what would a President Romney be doing now differently to President Obama to, in Romney's own words, protect U.S. interests in the aftermath of that attack?
I think if Mitt Romney were the President of the United States, he would be talking with his advisors, he would be consulting with the Secretary of State and other appropriate officials.
So that's the same as President Obama, isn't it?
That's exactly right. He would be doing probably what President Obama is doing. He would console the families. He would tell the nation that this was a terrible tragedy.
Right. But beyond that, you're suggesting but beyond that, as far as the foreign policy implications are concerned, how would a President Romney differ from a President Obama at this moment?
Well, we don't yet know that. I think that the thing that we don't know is whether or not Mitt Romney would be more predisposed to use some kind of force in responding to an incident like this one.
What sort
My
of
guess
force?
is that he probably would not.
Right.
Well, that is military force of some kind. It's some kind of a military response. Other presidents have done that kind of thing in the past. When an action took place against American citizens, they responded with some kind of with a military response, with some kind of a force response. And my guess is that given the tensions in that part of the world, given the fairly recent still changes in leadership in so many of the countries in the Middle East, I think that a President Mitt Romney would be very hesitant to move quickly or to make a quick or hasty decision.
So, how will the attack in Libya impact the U.S. election? To discuss this, we're joined by former State Department official Hillary Mann Leverett. She's also a professor at Yale University and American University. We also have Jonathan Brown, associate professor at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. And from Rio de Janeiro, Glenn Greenwald, the columnist for The Guardian newspaper. Actually, before we go on to some of that, Professor Hillary Mann Leverett, we're hearing quite a bit about Chris Stevens, the ambassador, and the man. You knew him.
I did. I had the opportunity to work with him throughout my time in the State Department, the U.S. Foreign Service. I didn't work with him closely on any particular project, but he was someone who was very substantive, who was looked to for his advice from the deputy secretaries of state, from secretaries of state, someone who was a real star in the Foreign Service. He was very substantive on a range of issues in the Middle East, was a really Middle East specialist. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, his engagement with Libya, I think, is being put out there as that how could they have killed him? He was just one of, he hung out with the rebels in Benghazi. How could they have killed him? Without really understanding what U.S. policy is about, which is U.S. policy identifies expatriates living outside of the country, tries to fund, arm, and convince them to come together to be a front to go back in to change regimes in countries we don't like. And at the end of the day, Chris Stevens did get wrapped up in that, and that's how he goes back to Libya.
We'll definitely explore some of those issues that you raised already later on in the program. But first of all, let's go to the beginning of this particular incident, at least the Romney campaign's use of this incident. The U.S. Embassy in Cairo issued a statement on Tuesday evening which went like this. The Embassy of the United States in Cairo condemns the continuing efforts by misguided individuals to hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, as we condemn efforts to offend believers of all religions. Today, the 11th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, on that anniversary, Americans are honoring our patriots and those who serve our nation as the fitting response to the enemies of democracy. Respect for religious beliefs is a cornerstone of American democracy. We firmly reject the actions of those who abuse the universal right of free speech to hurt the religious beliefs of others. And Glenn Greenwald, I mean, this was before the attack on the Egyptian embassy, but clearly the Romney campaign thought this was a moment to be seized, as far as we can tell.
Well, the Romney campaign has been incredibly inept in almost every way up until this point, but in this case they were really kind of a victim of bad timing. It was just more haplessness than ineptitude, I think, because that statement that you just read from the U.S. Embassy in Cairo was surprisingly, one might even say commendably, concerned with not offending further people in the Muslim world who have seen this repulsive film. And it really wasn't like a typical reaction of the U.S. government to such incidents, where they're usually very bellicose and Manichean about morally condemning the people who are against the United States. It was unusually concerned with the sensibilities of people in that region. And I think the Romney campaign thought they could exploit the unusualness of that statement to cast President Obama not just as weak, but sympathetic to the people who had been targeting the embassy. And the problem is, by the time everybody woke up and heard the Romney statement, by then they also heard the news that 4 people, including the ambassador, were killed, and it just came off looking incredibly exploitative and insensitive.
Even when the press corps traveling with Romney questioned him on this line of attack, actually Mitt Romney elaborated on his theme.
I don't think we ever hesitate when we see something which is a violation of our principles. We express immediately when we feel that the president and his administration have done something which is inconsistent with the principles of America. Simply put, having an embassy which has been breached and has protesters on its grounds, having violated the sovereignty of the United States, having that embassy reiterate a statement effectively apologizing for the right of free speech is not the right course for an administration.
Jonathan Brown, I mean, we heard a Romney surrogate a few moments ago suggesting rather candidly that this was purely a political tactic. However, when Romney does go down this line, in the context of this election, might he not be on quite fertile ground in some quarters, given the nature of the rhetoric we've been hearing?
I think so, and I think that's been part of the Republican political calculus at least since 2010, when they found how well the so-called Ground Zero Mosque issue played for basically drumming up Republican support for congressional candidates. And so sort of playing on the idea of American values being threatened by Muslims who don't share American values, talking about freedom of speech. These are the same thing we've seen, going back even in Europe with the cartoon crisis in 2005. And I think what the embassy in Cairo is doing, which is being diplomats and saying things that are not only diplomatically sensible, but also I think represent the sentiments of a lot of Americans, to go and undermine that or and attack that and bring up these I think very negative, but also unfortunately in the United States, tried and tested political methods is unfortunate.
But it's striking, though, that although the statement from the Cairo embassy seemed to be an intelligent way then of trying to reduce tensions, the White House pretty quickly distanced themselves even from that statement.
Yes, and it's striking because the Republican critique has been focused on Romney's concern about this embassy statement, but other important Republicans like Senator Grassley are even critiquing Obama's speech in June 2009 to the Muslim world that he gave from Cairo, and that these elements taken together show Obama being really weak and more sympathetic to Muslims than he is to real Americans. That is, I think, the undercurrent of the critique, as Jonathan so rightly points out. And in both cases, with this press statement from the embassy in Cairo and even the June 2009 speech, what you have from the Obama administration is not sticking with their principles, sticking with the campaign promise, not just to withdraw troops from Iraq, but to try to change the mentality in Washington that got us into that war. Instead of sticking with that, you have the Obama administration renouncing the statement from the embassy and walking back completely from its speech in 2009 to the Muslim world. And so the critique that Romney gives, unfortunately, I don't think is the appropriate one. The appropriate one should be, why is the Obama administration really so dishonest in its policy, and how could people in the Middle East really take America's word seriously as a constructive force, and what is the reason for their anger? We're just very reluctant to go into that.
Glenn Greenwald, at the very least, though, do you think this might now spark some kind of substantive foreign policy debate in this election? For example, the Romney campaign said that Obama has received a free pass, their term, on the Libyan intervention. Might this now perhaps raise some of the questions about Obama's record in a substantive manner?
No, I don't think there's any chance of that, unfortunately. And I think the reason is that it is absolutely true, as Hillary just suggested, that there are all kinds of radical flaws, fundamental deficiencies, and breaches of promise when it comes to the Obama foreign policy. Unfortunately, the Romney campaign and the Republican Party in general are so wedded, they're so uncreatively wedded to the same script that they've been reading from for 30 years, which is that the Democratic Party is weak on national security, that in particular they're overly sympathetic to Muslims and to Islamic radicals, that they're not able to articulate the real critique, which is that the president has been overly aggressive in involving the United States in that part of the world through all kinds of military intervention, things that have inflamed anti-American sentiment in that part of the world. And that's the real problem for the Romney campaign, is they want to get to the right of the president when it comes to the use of military force and national security, and it's virtually impossible to do that given how indiscriminate virtually the president has been when it comes to military force. And so you see them sort of fumbling around, because at the end of the day, what the American voter is going to look at when it comes to assessing President Obama's record and deciding whether these accusations of weakness are legitimate is the fact that, as the Democrats reminded them continuously almost every 5 minutes of their convention last week, he killed Osama bin Laden and has killed numerous people using escalated campaign of drone attacks. And at the end of the day, I think that's the box in which the Romney campaign is incapable of getting out of, which is that it's almost impossible to get to the right of President Obama. If they were a little more creative, they would do what George Bush did in 2000, which is ran to the left of the Democrats in foreign policy, promising a more humble foreign policy. But this candidate is just incapable of that kind of dexterity, and that's the problem that he has.
But I suppose it also raises the question of the box that President Obama's foreign policy is in as well. And when President Obama makes a statement as this, which we're about to play, you do wonder what is going to happen next as he's caught in this narrative in an election year.
No acts of terror will ever shake the resolve of this great nation. alter that character or eclipse the light of the values that we stand for. Today we mourn for more Americans who represent the very best of the United States of America. We will not waver in our commitment to see that justice is done for this terrible act, and make no mistake, justice will be done.
I mean, Hilary Mann Leverett, you've got to wonder then what that actually means. There's already talk of renewed drone activity now in Libya and so forth.
And we know what justice will be done means from President Obama, as Glenn pointed to. Justice will be done means without due process, means probably the track record is to use either drone attacks or other weapons to kill people without due process. Now, that may make people here feel good temporarily, but all it will do is further compound the hatred and resentment for U.S. policy, which is at the heart of the problem here. Communities throughout the Middle East are angry because 100,000 at least in Iraq have been killed, thousands more in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya, because of U.S. armed intervention. The idea that people wouldn't be angry about that, and the moral leaders in these communities, which often include their religious leaders and others who want to take advantage, that wouldn't all come together in an incendiary mix to retaliate against Americans. The idea that wouldn't happen, that is fantastical, and it's dangerous for Americans who travel
Well, actually,
abroad.
let's hear what the Secretary of State had to say on that topic. I mean, clearly, understandably, she was very shaken, but here's what she had to say.
Today, many Americans are asking, indeed, I asked myself, how could this happen? How could this happen in a country we helped liberate, in a city we helped save from destruction? This question reflects just how complicated and at times how confounding the world can be. But we must be clear-eyed even in our grief. This was an attack by a small and savage group, not the people or government of Libya.
Jonathan Brown, I mean, what do you think of when you hear that? I mean, does that seem to be, they are genuinely confounded by the reaction,
well, I mean,
or how they're perceived? Or?
I mean, obviously I think I speak for all of us when I condemn these acts of violence, and our hearts go out to the families of those people who died. But I think in a way Egypt is more interesting to look at than Libya, because the Libyan case is, I think this, like the Secretary said, is exceptional. This is a small group of people who carry out this attack. Whereas the Egyptian case is really a very broad, a protest, a broad appeal to a wide range of people from different parts of the Egyptian society, both religious and non-religious, who took part in this protest in front of the embassy. And I think when I hear her statement, what I think in the context of Egypt is, is it really this surprising? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, if you've just been paying attention to, let's say, global political life since 2005, that if you do something really, really insulting about the Prophet Muhammad, and this film is, remarkably insulting.
You really think it's simply about the film?
No, but it's not just about the film, obviously. It's about, I think it's really about community. It's about Muslims saying we want to have our sensibilities taken into account when people talk about speech and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. It's about Muslims in Europe and in America wanting to have their sensibilities taken into account as citizens in these countries. And what's happened since the cartoon crisis is that people have, governments in the United States and Europe have come out repeatedly and said, no, this is about free speech. But in Europe and the United States, governments have absolutely no problem restricting speech if it crosses certain red lines, and they don't want to take into consideration the sensibilities of Muslims either internationally or within their own countries. So it's really, I think it's about saying we want our sensitivities respected. And to say that we're surprised this happened, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think there's a really fundamental strategic flaw for U.S. policy, and we do it over and over again. It has to do about empire. It is that we look at each country, at each place, and we see the expatriates we want to see in their cafes in Paris, who parrot our lines that want secular liberalism, and we arm, fund, and train them to go back and impose a political order on their societies, which have very different views, histories, cares, concerns. And then we're shocked that those expatriates that we listen to repeatedly, Iraq, Iran, Libya, everywhere, historically, even Cuba, it's not even just the Middle East, We listen to these people over and over again, not because we're stupid, but because we have a very determined focus for dominance. And if we have these people to show that we're really wanted, people really want the U.S. to come in with their military and kill thousands of people and impose a foreign political order, that justifies what we've done.
Glenn Greenwald, we'll return to those foreign policy implications in a second, but when you start hearing people discuss freedom of speech in this manner, though, are there not alarm bells perhaps ringing? I mean, is that debate, do you think, now being raised about what is permissible in a film and so forth? Might there be dangers down the line if we go down that route?
Of course there are dangers. I mean, I actually, disagree a little bit with what Jonathan said. I don't think that you really can find very many examples where the United States, under its laws, constricts or criminalizes the expression of views on the grounds that it offends particular religions. I mean, there was, famous incidents of celebrities going on national television and tearing up pictures of the Pope, which drove Catholics in the United States, into a rage. There are plays that have offended Christians and art exhibits that have done the same. In all kinds of ways. One that famously depicted Jesus Christ dumped into a pitcher of urine that Rudy Giuliani tried unsuccessfully to ban. So I think the ethos in the United States is very much one that says even if ideas are incredibly offensive to certain religions, that we still, as a matter of our understanding and conception of liberty, protect them. We can denounce it, we can be disgusted by it, as any decent person would be looking at this film, but that we don't criminalize or use the power of the state to outlaw it, because that is a dangerous road. Having said that, there are lots of different ways where the United States government, in the name of the war on terror, has restricted the rights, usually of American Muslims, to express a wide range of views and have criminalized them by calling them material support for terrorism. There are Muslims sitting in prison for having expressed ideas that the United States government has decided should be barred. And so this double standard, I think, is coming into play to some extent in terms of the anger in this region. But I think a lot of it has to do with just the fact that the United States continuously intervenes in this region without seemingly any regard for what the outcome and the consequences will be.
Jonathan Brown, can you see the dangers of going down your route?
Look, I'm a big fan of Glenn Greenwald's writings. I mean, I agree with him overall. But I would say that in the United States, in our legal history, we do constrict speech, sometimes, first of all, going back to freedom of speech to the beginning of the 20th century, but also things like Black versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court decided that you cannot do things, you can't, for example, burn crosses with the purpose of intimidating people. This expression was criminalized, or is allowed to be criminalized. Now, what that comes out of is out of an American experience of what certain symbols mean. And Americans reject these symbols, and sometimes it's okay to criminalize them.
Right.
What Muslims...
Very quickly, we've only got like 1 minute left. You'd criminalize someone making a low-budget, slightly crackpot film
I'm not calling for
internet
criminalization of these movies.
Okay.
What I'm trying to say is that Americans, people in the West like to talk about this sort of absolute freedom of speech that Muslims just don't get. Okay, right. But everybody has restrictions on freedom of speech. Everybody has sensibilities, and I think what Muslims have been asking is that you don't have to outlaw things, but at least condemn it. Take a strong stance against this. Why doesn't YouTube, for example, take down these videos?
Because where do you stop? I suppose this is the question.
They take down lots of other
We're going to move on
material.
because we've only got 1 minute left. Hillary Mann Leverett, one thing then I think everyone is agreed on here, though, is foreign policy certainly does have implications. Mm-hmm. I asked the Romney surrogate earlier, how would Romney be different? Are we any clearer as to what they would be doing differently to further American interests in the Middle East post-Arab Spring?
No, I think Glenn alluded to this earlier. They could take the George Bush tack that he took in 2000. He could put forward a different, more humble, more realistic foreign policy, but he's not. Romney will, I think, support and probably goad Obama into delivering justice without due process, killing more people in the process, and further endangering America's strategic position.
But earlier on, there seemed to be some debate as to whether the neocons of the Bush administration were now fully in charge, or whether Robert Zoellick, who's supposedly, quote, a realist, has now been hired by Mitt Romney.
Are we any clearer? There's a lot that's being made of this kind of division between neocons and realists, but we have to remember that the key strategic flaw that happened in U.S. policy happens in 1991 under the realist dream team of Father Bush 41, when Scowcroft et al. Decided to keep tens of thousands of troops in Saudi Arabia with no exit strategy. That decision to occupy the heartland of the Muslim world is in part what has touched off this whole stream of events.
Is there a choice in this election on foreign policy in 10 seconds?
I don't think so.
All right, Hilary Mann Leverett, thank you very much. Glenn Greenwald, thank you. Jonathan Brown, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. For now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program.